There's a question most people never think to ask, not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. Why do corporations seem almost untouched by inflation while everyone else feels squeezed from every side? Inflation is usually described as something that happens to the economy. Prices rise, money loses value, everyone adjusts. That's the story we're told. But that framing hides something important. Inflation doesn't land evenly. It presses down harder on some people and barely touches others. For most people, inflation shows up in small, exhausting ways. Groceries cost more, rent creeps up, paychecks stay the same. The math never quite works, even when you're doing everything right. It feels like running in place while the ground slowly tilts. At the same time, some companies move through inflation almost effortlessly. Their costs rise, but so do their prices. Their debts shrink in real terms. Their assets quietly reprice upward, not because they're doing something illegal, but because of where they're standing when the value of money starts to shift. Inflation doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't punish the corrupt and reward the virtuous. It responds to where you're standing in the economic architecture when the currency starts to weaken. And most people are standing in the wrong place. They don't realize it because the language around inflation is deliberately vague. We talk about rising prices as if that's the whole story, as if inflation is just an unfortunate weather pattern that makes everything cost more. But inflation isn't weather. It's a shift in the rules of value itself. And when those rules shift, some positions gain altitude while others sink in value. The question isn't whether this happens. The question is how. Let's start with debt. Not the kind you hear about in political speeches, the kind that sits on corporate balance sheets, quiet and enormous. When a corporation borrows money, it's making a calculated trade. It exchanges a promise to repay later for resources it can use now. That promise is denominated in currency, dollars, euros, whatever unit the loan specifies. Now here's what most people miss. The amount doesn't change. If you borrow $10 million today at a fixed rate, you owe $10 million in 5 years. The number stays the same, but the weight of that number doesn't, because inflation is eating the currency the whole time. Every year the dollar weakens, the real burden of that debt shrinks, not because the corporation paid anything down, not because they negotiated better terms, just because the measuring stick itself got shorter. Imagine borrowing a ton of weight when a ton meant 2,000 pounds, then repaying it later when a ton means 1,800. You're handing back the same number, but the actual load is lighter. That's what inflation does to fixed debt. It's not a trick, it's not even clever, it's just arithmetic. But the impact is massive. Corporations structure themselves to hold enormous amounts of long-term fixed-rate debt. They lock in interest rates when they're low, they stretch repayment timelines as far as lenders will allow, and then they wait, not because they're visionaries, because they understand the game. When inflation arrives, their liabilities deflate in real terms, while their revenue base, priced in the now weakened currency, expands to match the new normal. The debt becomes easier to service. The balance sheet breathes. This isn't speculation. This is what happens, and it happens quietly, in boardrooms and earnings calls while the rest of the economy wonders why groceries cost more. Now think about who's on the other side of that equation. Savers, wage earners, people holding cash or near cash instruments. They're creditors, even if they don't think of themselves that way. Their position is the mirror image of corporate debt. They're holding claims denominated in currency, expecting that currency to retain its value over time, but it doesn't. Every month inflation runs, their position erodes. The number stays the same, but the purchasing power behind it thins out, silently, predictably. They can't lock in protection the way corporations can. They can't issue 30-year bonds to themselves. They can't borrow against future earnings at favorable rates and invest the proceeds into assets that will appreciate alongside inflation. They're structurally exposed. And the gap between those two positions, debtor with assets versus creditor without leverage, is where the transfer happens. It's not theft, it's architecture. So debt gets lighter. But that's only the first mechanism. The second is about what corporations own, not in an abstract sense, in a physical, operational, balance sheet sense. NVIDIA doesn't just sell GPUs, it owns the intellectual property behind them. It owns the design infrastructure. It owns the relationships with foundries. It owns the ecosystem of developers who make its hardware indispensable. Amazon doesn't just ship packages. It owns warehouses, sorting facilities, delivery networks, cloud server farms, the entire circulatory system of modern commerce. Walmart doesn't just move product. It owns real estate, distribution centers, supply chain leverage that smaller competitors can't match. These aren't decorative assets. They're the machinery of production and distribution. And when inflation comes, these assets don't sit still. Their value reprices upward. Not because they're suddenly more productive, not because they're generating better returns, because the currency used to measure them has weakened, and the market adjusts. A warehouse worth $50 million in stable currency becomes worth $60 million in inflated currency, not because the building changed, because the measuring unit did. The same logic applies to intellectual property, to platforms, to infrastructure. NVIDIA's GPU architecture becomes more valuable as the dollar weakens and competitors struggle to match its scale. Amazon's logistics network compounds its advantage as inflation pressures smaller firms. Walmart's supplier relationships and volume leverage insulated from cost shocks that would cripple independence. This isn't about working harder. It's about owning the right things when the currency shifts. And here's the detail most people overlook. These assets generate cash flow in the inflated currency, which means revenue rises nominally even if real output stays flat. The corporation isn't producing more value, it's just collecting more currency units for the same value. And because its debt is fixed and its assets are appreciating, the net effect is expansion. On paper, the company looks stronger. In reality, it's just standing in the right position when the tides change. But there's a third mechanism, and this one touches everyone: pricing power. Corporations can raise prices immediately. You've seen it. One quarter, the price is X. Next quarter, it's X plus 8%. The explanation is vague: supply chain issues, input costs, market conditions, but the increase is real, and it's instant. Wages don't work that way. Wages are sticky. They adjust slowly, often annually, and only after negotiation or policy shifts. They lag behind price increases by months, sometimes years. And for many workers, they don't adjust at all. This delay is everything. When prices rise faster than wages, the corporation captures the difference. Not as profit necessarily, sometimes just as operating room. But the gap is real, and it flows in one direction. NVIDIA can raise GPU prices in response to demand and inflation, and customers either pay or wait. Amazon can adjust marketplace fees and shipping costs continuously, algorithmically. Walmart can shift supplier terms and shelf prices in real time. The workers stocking the shelf? They're waiting for the annual review. Is the customer buying the product? They're absorbing the increase immediately, out of income that hasn't caught up yet. This isn't anyone's fault. It's how the machinery is built. Corporations operate in markets where pricing adjusts to signals. Labor markets move slower because they involve contracts, norms, and human lives. The asymmetry isn't designed to punish workers. It's just a feature of how different markets respond to change. But the result is the same. Inflation creates a lag. And in that lag, value transfers from those who can't adjust quickly to those who can. You might be watching this from somewhere outside the United States. Maybe you're dealing with a different currency, a different inflation rate, a different political system. It doesn't matter. The structure is the same. The mechanisms don't care about borders. They care about position. Debtor versus creditor, asset owner versus wage earner, price setter versus price taker. Wherever you are, the question is the same. Which side of that line are you on? Inflation doesn't arrive with an announcement. It seeps in, quietly. A little less in your savings, a little more on your receipts. Most people experience it as erosion, not collapse. Something slipping away slowly enough that it's hard to point to a single cause. But erosion depends on where you're standing. Some surfaces wear down, others don't. Some are reinforced by the very forces that weaken everything else.
Let's bring this back to the companies. NVIDIA sits in a rare position. It produces something the market believes it needs desperately: compute power for AI, for data centers, for the infrastructure of the next decade. Real or imagined, that narrative gives it pricing insulation. When costs rise, NVIDIA doesn't absorb them. It passes them forward. And because its product is scarce and its competition is limited, the market accepts the increase. Its margins don't compress, they hold. Sometimes they expand. Amazon's advantage is different but related. It operates at a scale where it can absorb cost shocks that would break smaller competitors. When fuel costs rise, Amazon feels it, but it also controls enough of the logistics chain that it can negotiate, adjust, and spread the impact across millions of transactions. The customer feels the pinch. Amazon feels the adjustment. The independent retailer who can't match that scale, they feel the end. Walmart's model is volume and compression. It negotiates from a position of dependency. Suppliers need Walmart more than Walmart needs any single supplier. When inflation hits, Walmart pushes costs backwards onto manufacturers and forward onto consumers. It maintains its position by leveraging the fact that customers have fewer alternatives and suppliers have fewer buyers. None of this is innovation, it's leverage, and inflation makes that leverage more valuable. The strange part is how invisible this all is. People see prices rising. They see their paychecks stagnating. They see corporations reporting record revenue, and they feel something is wrong. But the explanation they're given is almost always incomplete. They're told it's greed, or supply chains, or government spending. And those things might be factors, but they're not the structure. The structure is the difference between holding debt and holding savings, between owning appreciating assets and owning depreciating claims, between setting prices and accepting them. Inflation doesn't create that structure, it reveals it. There's no solution presented here, no policy recommendation, no call to action. This isn't that kind of explanation. The goal is just to see the map clearly, to understand that when inflation runs, it doesn't hit everyone equally. It hits positions, and most people are standing in a position that loses, not because they made bad choices, because the system is structured that way. Corporations are positioned as debtors with assets and pricing power. Individuals are positioned as creditors with wages and limited leverage. When the currency weakens, one side's burden lightens while the other side's purchasing power erodes. That's not a conspiracy, that's just geometry. Maybe you're watching this late at night. Maybe you're trying to understand why things feel harder even though you're working just as much. Maybe you already knew some of this and you're just looking for confirmation that you're not imagining it. You're not. The structure is real, and understanding it doesn't fix it, but it does something else. It changes where you're looking.
The companies mentioned here aren't villains. They're not breaking rules, bending laws, or operating in secret. They're doing exactly what the system allows, and exactly what it rewards. They're winning not because they're immoral, but because they understand the board they're playing on. The question, then, isn't whether they deserve blame. That's a moral discussion, and morality isn't what moves capital. The real question is whether you understand the board too. Because once you see how inflation actually moves value, not randomly, not emotionally, but structurally, other things start to come into focus. Patterns that used to feel confusing begin to feel almost obvious. You start to notice why certain financial advice sounds universal, but only works for a narrow group of people. Why strategies that are praised as smart at the corporate level become dangerous at the personal level. Why is debt framed as reckless when you're small, but treated as strategic when you're large? You begin to notice why inflation is talked about as a shared burden, something everyone experiences equally, when in reality it behaves more like a sorting mechanism. Quiet, impersonal, precise. And eventually, you notice something else, the language around money itself.
how it smooths over differences in position, how it implies a single economy, a single set of forces, a single game being played by everyone at once. As if households and multinational corporations are facing the same risks with the same tools and the same margins for error. They're not. The economy has layers, not social ones, financial ones. And inflation doesn't blur those layers, it sharpens them. It lifts those who hold assets, pricing power, and long-term debt, and it presses down on those who hold wages, savings, and fixed obligations. It does this slowly enough that it feels natural, inevitable, almost invisible. So here's where we are. Inflation makes debt cheaper over time, but only if you're large enough to borrow on stable terms. Inflation makes assets more valuable, but only if you already own them. Inflation allows prices to move quickly, while wages lag behind, adjusting late or not at all. These forces don't operate in isolation. They compound, month after month, year after year, quietly, transferring advantage from those who hold claims on currency to those who hold claims on real things and market access. It's legal, it's predictable, and unless you're trained to look for it, it's almost impossible to see while you're living inside it. Most people aren't looking. They're working, budgeting, adjusting, trying to keep pace with numbers that never quite stop moving. You can agree with this or not. You can believe the system should change or believe it functions exactly as intended. That debate matters, but it's not the point here. The point is orientation, understanding where you're standing when the value of money shifts, understanding why effort alone doesn't always translate into progress, understanding why the same economic force can feel like pressure to one person and an opportunity to another. Because inflation doesn't punish income, it punishes position. And if you don't know what position you're in, you can't fully understand what's happening to you. Now you do. What you do with that understanding is your choice.